Today, altering photos to deceive others online is commonplace, but one of the most disastrous cases of visual deception occurred nearly 500 years ago. It did not end with mere embarrassment. It ended with the blood of England's most powerful minister. The story begins in the court of King Henry VIII, a paranoid monarch. Royal painter Hans Holbein used his brush to distort the truth. He transformed a plain princess into a beauty, pushing the king into a disastrous marriage. That deceptive portrait led the marriage broker, Chief Minister Thomas Cromwell, straight to a brutal beheading. As for the painter, he escaped the king's wrath only to die later in the plague, his body tossed into an unmarked mud grave. Hans Holbein the Younger was born during the freezing winter of 1497 in Augsburg, a free imperial city securely situated within the Holy Roman Empire. Functioning as a critical node in the European economic network, Augsburg was heavily dominated by immensely wealthy banking families, most notably the formidable Fuggers. This massive concentration of commercial capital created a highly lucrative regional market that aggressively funded the production of high-quality visual art. Consequently, Holbein was not born into an isolated intellectual vacuum, but rather, he was thrust directly into the daily, practical mechanics of commercial visual production. His father, Hans Holbein the Elder, was a prominent and established painter who operated a busy state-sanctioned workshop within the competitive Augsburg guild system. From early childhood, the younger Holbein was deeply steeped in the complex chemistry of art, meticulously absorbing the fundamental commerce and trade of the profession. Initially, the young apprentice did not view painting as a transcendent spiritual calling. Instead, the discipline was perceived strictly as an industrial and highly mechanical process. His early education focused intensely on the precise logistical mechanics of the craft, demanding the exhaustive manual grinding of raw lapis lazuli to produce incredibly expensive ultramarine blue pigment. Furthermore, the daily curriculum mandated the dangerous boiling of linseed oil and the rigorous preparation of solid oak panels, which required the application of multiple flawless layers of animal glue and chalk gesso. Through this exhaustive, labor-intensive training, the developing artist was systematically taught to observe the physical world, ultimately cultivating a clinical mathematical precision in his visual assessments. In 1515, the 18-year-old Holbein sought to expand his economic opportunities. The art market in Augsburg had become overly saturated. Consequently, he relocated to the city of Basel in Switzerland. At this time, Basel was undergoing a profound intellectual and cultural transformation. Basel served as the epicenter of the Northern European printing industry. The city operated as a vital hub for the rapid dissemination of new data. It printed and distributed advanced theological and philosophical texts. Here, Holbein fully integrated into the intellectual framework of the Northern Renaissance. He was exposed to the emerging philosophies of Christian humanism. The central doctrine of this movement was championed by prominent scholars residing in Basel. They advocated for the pursuit of objective, unvarnished truth. This was achieved through the meticulous study of classical texts and the natural world. The most significant asset Holbein acquired in Basel was not a new artistic technique. It was a primary political and intellectual connection. He successfully embedded himself in the network of Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was the most famous and influential humanist scholar in Europe. Erasmus possessed a massive continent-wide correspondence network. This network functioned as the primary intellectual nervous system of the era. Holbein provided detailed illustrations for Erasmus's widely distributed publications. This notably included the highly satirical text titled The Praise of Folly. He also painted multiple portraits of the prominent scholar. In these works, he captured the precise physical reality of the aging philosopher's face. During the 1510s and early 1520s, Holbein absorbed these lofty ideals. He believed the artist's primary function was to document objective reality without distortion. However, this intellectual idealism depended entirely on a stable economic foundation. In the 1520s, that foundation was systematically and rapidly destroyed. The Protestant Reformation radically altered the geopolitical and economic landscape. Initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, it quickly spread across Europe. By the mid-1520s, the Reformed theology had severely impacted the city of Basel. This shift was largely driven by radical theologians like Huldrych Zwingli. The new theological framework fundamentally redefined the societal function of visual art. Protestant reformers classified religious imagery as unacceptable idolatry. This included altarpieces, statues of saints, and devotional murals. This ideological shift triggered a massive immediate economic consequence for artists' guilds. The primary revenue stream for a 16th century painter was ecclesiastical commissions. When the churches ceased ordering altarpieces, the regional art market effectively collapsed to zero. Furthermore, existing artworks were physically destroyed in waves of iconoclastic rioting. Hans Holbein, now a married man with children, faced a stark economic reality. The pursuit of humanist truth could not generate capital in Basel. The city had essentially criminalized the visual representation of the divine. He urgently required a new, profitable market. He needed patrons who possessed massive concentrations of liquid wealth. Crucially, these patrons had to desire secular, non-religious portraiture. In 1526, Holbein executed a highly strategic economic migration to survive. He leveraged his established intellectual network for diplomatic support. He secured a formal letter of recommendation from Desiderius Erasmus. This critical letter was addressed to the Lord Chancellor of England. That man was the brilliant statesman and fellow humanist, Sir Thomas More. Erasmus's letter contained a stark, purely economic justification for the relocation. He wrote directly to More, stating that the arts were freezing in Basel. Armed with this critical piece of diplomatic leverage, Holbein packed his instruments. He crossed the European continent and navigated the English Channel. He arrived in the capital of the Tudor state seeking lasting financial stability. He carried with him the philosophies of the Northern Renaissance. However, he was entirely unprepared for the lethal operational mechanics of King Henry VIII's court. The contrast between academic Basel and Tudor London was extreme. Under the initial patronage of Thomas More, Holbein integrated into the English network. He gained access to the corridors of Whitehall Palace. He also entered the primary residences of the elite Tudor aristocracy. The physical environment of the court was specifically designed to project overwhelming power. This power was projected through the aggressive, constant display of capital. The sensory data of this specific environment reveals a calculated design. The stone walls of the royal residences were lined with massive tapestries. These were gold-woven pieces imported directly from Flanders at great expense. These tapestries were designed to insulate the rooms and visually intimidate foreign ambassadors. The air within the court was also heavily manipulated. It was thick with the scent of imported, highly expensive commodities. This included burning cloves, ambergris, and distilled rosewater. The aristocrats navigating these corridors were draped in luxurious, heavy fabrics. They wore layers of silk doublets, cloth of gold, and imported velvet. However, this opulent physical veneer served a highly specific function. It was a visual and olfactory shield designed to mask the regime's reality. The Tudor state absolutely did not operate on the principles of humanist philosophy. It operated on terror, ruthless factional warfare, and absolute power. The monarch exercised unchecked authority over the lives of his subjects. Holbein witnessed the brutal mechanics of Tudor survival firsthand. The juxtaposition between the protected spaces of the court and state violence was unavoidable. When Holbein traversed the city of London, he navigated a dangerous landscape. Moving between the estates of his patrons, he saw the executioner's domain. The primary manifestation of the king's authority was the spiked gates of London Bridge. As Holbein observed the aristocrats in the perfumed court, he noted the consequences of failure. Above the stone arches of the bridge, severed heads were actively displayed. These were the heads of former ministers, theologians, and minor nobility. They were placed on iron pikes as a severe visual deterrent. The forensic reality of this horrific display was entirely clinical. The heads were parboiled in vats of water to preserve the tissue. They were then coated in thick black tar to delay rapid decomposition. In the intense heat of the London summer, the tar melted. The preserved tissue was actively picked apart by scavenger birds. The atmospheric conditions of the execution docks also carried a specific scent. Tower Hill and Tyburn smelled heavily of river mud and rotting organic matter. This olfactory reality contrasted permanently with the burning incense of the royal chapels. The continuous visual exposure to state-sanctioned violence executed an immediate conditioning upon the artist. The first and most vital law of survival in Tudor England was seared into his mind. In this kingdom, telling the objective, unvarnished truth was a highly dangerous act. It was often a suicidal one. Holbein recognized that his humanist mandate was entirely incompatible with physical survival in London. Consequently, he executed a fundamental reclassification of his own artistic medium. He understood that under King Henry VIII, art was not a mechanism to honor truth. It was not a tool to document human flaws. Instead, art was transformed into pure political currency. It was a highly specialized utility used to project loyalty and establish dynastic legitimacy. Most importantly, it was used to purchase another day of life. Holbein was no longer the idealistic young man from Basel. He was now in his late 30s and early 40s. He became a deeply cynical, hardened survivor, navigating a lethal political environment. The youthful naivety of his Augsburg and Basel days was completely eradicated. It was replaced by a cold, calculated willingness to discard his professional ethics. He did this to appease a paranoid and highly unpredictable dictator. Holbein observed the specific mechanics of the Tudor state. He noted that the state executioner dictated the fate of the nobility with an iron axe. Holbein possessed no military power, aristocratic title, or legal protections. Therefore, he developed his own unique survival mechanism. He learned to manipulate the visual record of the entire era. He did this to ensure his own head remained attached to his shoulders. To actively thrive in the Tudor court, Holbein mastered visual manipulation. When officially appointed as the king's painter, his mandate was fundamentally altered. He was no longer retained by the state to document anatomical or psychological reality. Instead, he was retained to forge entirely new political identities. He became a manufacturer of high-grade visual propaganda. Holbein achieved this operational objective by deliberately obscuring the physical truths of his subjects. A forensic examination of his canvas reveals the specific artistic techniques he deployed to execute these forgeries. When commissioned to paint the women of the court, his brush functioned as a tool of erasure. The physiological reality of elite Tudor women was defined by extreme stress. They lived in a constant state of hypervigilance. They knew that a loss of royal favor equated to the executioner's block. Their bodies also suffered the severe physical toll of repeated pregnancies and miscarriages. Holbein systematically concealed this exhausting reality. He utilized layers of semi-transparent glazes to build up the skin tones. This eliminated the dark, exhausted tissue under their eyes. He smoothed out the ravages of minor illnesses and smallpox scarring. He also erased the damage caused by toxic lead-based cosmetics. He constructed an impenetrable mask of serene porcelain perfection. The women on his canvases did not display the terror of their environment. They displayed the flawless, placid obedience required by the patriarchal state. The most critical manipulation executed by Holbein involved King Henry VIII himself. By the late 1530s, the king was in a state of severe physical decline. He was no longer the athletic golden prince persona of his youth. The forensic reality of the monarch at this time was one of catastrophic decay. Henry VIII had ballooned into a morbidly obese figure. His waistline eventually measured a staggering 54 inches. This immense physical mass severely restricted his mobility and pulmonary function. He struggled for breath during even minor physical exertions. More critically, a catastrophic jousting accident in January 1536 had caused massive trauma. The injury to his legs resulted in a chronic, gaping, necrotic wound. It was likely a severe varicose ulcer complicated by a bone infection. The ulcer constantly leaked blood, pus, and serous fluid. The bacterial infection generated an overpowering odor of rotting organic tissue. Foreign ambassadors documented detecting the smell from several rooms away. The wound required agonizing daily draining by his medical staff. The king could barely stand unsupported on his rotting legs. This was the physical reality of the sovereign. Holbein was commissioned to paint over it. In 1537, Holbein was ordered to design a massive mural. It was for the Privy Chamber at the Palace of Whitehall. This mural was intended to be the defining image of the Tudor dynasty. Holbein did not paint King Henry VIII as he truly existed. He engineered a total visual fabrication of the monarch. He transformed a decaying, disabled, morbidly obese man into an invincible god of war. The structural geometry of the Whitehall portrait was entirely engineered for intimidation. Holbein manipulated the proportions of the human body to project absolute dominance. He painted the king with his legs planted aggressively wide apart. This created a massive, stable triangular base that communicated unshakable power. He entirely erased the necrotic wounds and the physical weakness of the legs. He rendered them as thick, muscular pillars wrapped in immaculate white silk. Holbein manipulated the king's torso using heavy padding and an expansive fur-lined surcoat. This artificially broadened the shoulders to impossible dimensions. This specific geometric manipulation masked the severe obesity of the waistline. It reclassified the king's sheer physical bulk as pure, intimidating muscle mass. Furthermore, Holbein placed a highly detailed, prominent codpiece at the center of the composition. This was not a standard fashion documentation. It was a deliberate projection of the king's dynastic virility. It was a highly politicized statement for a monarch obsessed with securing male succession. This visual manipulation was executed with immense technical precision. It achieved its ultimate, terrifying objective. The king internalized the lie. Henry VIII looked at the Whitehall mural and believed he possessed this athletic form. Holbein successfully overrode the monarch's physical decay with a layer of pigment. Through his position, Holbein was granted an extraordinary level of clearance. He became the keeper of a silent, highly classified vault of secrets. He possessed operational privilege, denied to senior ministers and ambassadors. He was the only outsider permitted consistently into the absolute privacy of royal bedchambers. To execute preliminary sketches, Holbein required subjects to remain stationary for hours. These intimate sessions occurred in highly restricted private spaces. In these rooms, heavy ceremonial armor and distracting silks were stripped away. Holbein saw the court completely naked, both anatomically and psychologically. He witnessed the hidden tears of terrified queens preparing for volatile public appearances. He observed physical evidence of venereal diseases and dermatological infections. He saw structural abnormalities ravaging the nobility beneath their expensive garments. While mixing pigments in corners, his presence was often completely ignored. Consequently, he overheard the hushed, desperate whispers of treason. He listened to the active plotting of intense factional warfare. He absorbed the raw, unfiltered terror governing daily government operations. Hans Holbein knew every corrupt and diseased crevice of the entire Tudor regime. Possessing this lethal data required an absolute fail-safe survival protocol. At 40 years old, Holbein made a conscious operational choice. He chose to become a silent, mute wooden chest. He recognized that possessing information was dangerous, but communicating it was fatal. He kept his mouth firmly shut and maintained a posture of absolute submission. He kept his head bowed over his easel at all times. His eyes focused entirely on his palette and drafting paper. He rigidly compartmentalized all the auditory data he quietly received. When he heard a courtier whispering treason, he did not react. When he saw the king wincing in agony, he did not document the pain. He simply reached for the specific pigment required for the painting. Silence was not merely a professional courtesy in this volatile regime. A misplaced word could be classified as high treason under the Treason Act of 1534. Silence was the only reliable armor against the executioner's block. Holbein survived by ensuring he was perceived exclusively as a mechanical instrument. He projected an image devoid of independent thought or political opinions. Subjecting Holbein's portfolio to historical analysis yields a chilling realization. His body of work functions as a psychological horror document. It is a literal visual ledger of the condemned. Observers examine the vibrant, hyper-realistic eyes of the Tudor elite on his oak panels. However, a gruesome historical reality undercuts the aesthetic beauty. Almost all of those eyes were eventually gouged out by scavenger birds. Almost all of those necks were physically severed by the axe or sword. Holbein was drafting preliminary memorial photographs for the soon-to-be dead. The psychological weight of this specific function must be carefully evaluated. Holbein spent weeks studying the exact topography of a human face. He mapped capillary structures, jawline geometry, and light reflections. He established an intense silent intimacy with his elite subjects. Then, systematically, the state eradicated those exact subjects. The indiscriminate brutality of the legal machinery spared absolutely no one. Holbein was forced to document the faces of friends and patrons directly before their slaughter. The most defining example involves Sir Thomas More. More was a brilliant statesman and a leading humanist scholar. He was Holbein's first benefactor upon his arrival in England. More had welcomed the young foreign artist directly into his Chelsea home. He provided the essential network required to secure initial royal commissions. In 1527, Holbein painted the definitive portrait of Thomas More. He utilized his humanist training to its maximum potential here. He did not idealize More. He painted him with an aura of supreme, heavy intellect and objective truth. He meticulously documented the slight stubble on More's chin and his velvet robes. However, the political environment rapidly deteriorated. More refused to swear the oath of supremacy, holding fast to Catholic theology. He refused to legally recognize King Henry VIII as supreme head of the church. In 1535, the Tudor state executed its legal mandate against him. Thomas More was arrested, tried for high treason, and quickly condemned. On July 6, 1535, the head Holbein had mapped was struck off on Tower Hill. The state then enacted its standard deterrent. More's head was taken by the executioner and boiled in a vat of water. It was impaled on a heavy wooden pike and paraded to London Bridge. The historical record clearly documents Holbein's calculated reaction to the butchery of his primary patron. He did absolutely nothing. He did not raise his voice in protest or write letters to colleagues. He did not utilize his art to memorialize the martyrdom of his friend. Holbein strictly enforced his established survival protocol. He maintained absolute, unbreakable silence regarding the political execution. He took the preliminary charcoal sketches he had made of More and his family. He hid them in the darkest, most classified corners of his studio. He ensured no agent of the state could find visual evidence of his association. More's execution confirmed the absolute necessity of Holbein's operational methodology. It proved that intellect, loyalty, and truth offered zero protection in Tudor England. The artist internalized this data and tightened his grip on his brushes. He prepared to execute whatever visual lies the surviving regime demanded. This psychological conditioning is further exemplified by his involvement with Queen Anne Boleyn. When Anne Boleyn secured the crown in 1533, Holbein was contracted by Hanseatic merchants. He designed the visual pageantry for her massive coronation procession. He operated as a primary architect of state propaganda. He designed a massive, highly complex triumphal arch depicting Mount Parnassus. He utilized his mastery of classical allegory to visually legitimize her controversial elevation. He designed exquisite custom jewelry exclusively for her personal use. He was entirely embedded in the Boleyn faction's visual apparatus, focused entirely on survival. 3 years later, the brutal, fundamental reality of the Tudor court asserted itself. Anne Boleyn failed to produce a surviving male heir. The king's dynastic requirements shifted. The legal machinery of the state was deployed to dismantle her faction. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested, subjected to a rapid, predetermined trial, and convicted of high treason. The specific mechanics of her termination were unprecedented in English history. King Henry VIII opted to bypass the standard English execution method for treasonous nobility, which utilized a heavy iron axe and a wooden block. Instead, he authorized the importation of a specialized executioner from Saint-Omer in France. This operative utilized a highly sharpened, heavy, double-edged continental sword. The physical mechanics of this method required the subject to kneel upright, without a block. On May 19, 1536, on the Tower Green, the French swordsman executed a horizontal, high-velocity strike. The metallurgical density of the sword, combined with the kinetic energy of the swing, severed the cervical vertebrae and completely detached the head in a single fraction of a second. During this highly publicized state execution of his former patron, Holbein maintained absolute rigid silence. He did not leverage his position as the king's painter to petition for mercy. He did not document the execution in his art. He executed his established survival protocol. He retreated to the security of his studio. He located the preliminary chalk and ink sketches he had meticulously drafted of Anne Boleyn during her reign. He did not destroy them, as they possessed intrinsic artistic data, but he entirely removed them from circulation. He archived them in the classified hidden sectors of his portfolio. He seamlessly transferred his allegiance to the new administrative reality. He immediately began drafting portraits of the king's new wife, Jane Seymour. The artist demonstrated that his loyalty was not tethered to human beings. It was tethered exclusively to the sovereign's current political directives. Operating continuously within this hyperlethal environment exacted a severe neurological and physiological toll on the artist. As Holbein entered his late 30s and early 40s, the psychological weight of his complicity began to manifest somatically. The historical record and subsequent analysis of his daily psychological rhythm indicate a man plagued by chronic severe anxiety. The specific cognitive dissonance required to perform his function was absolutely staggering. Holbein spent his days in highly lit, quiet studios, meticulously grinding pigments, mixing linseed oil, and applying micro layers of paint to capture the radiant, confident smiles of the Tudor aristocracy. He engineered eternal aesthetic beauty out of human flesh. Simultaneously, he possessed the analytical capacity to recognize that this very flesh was actively marked for butchery. He was fully aware that the living, breathing subjects he was painting, the individuals speaking and sitting before his easel, were statistically likely to be screaming in physical agony on a wooden scaffold within a matter of months. He was manufacturing visual immortality for a population that possessed an incredibly high mortality rate dictated by state violence. The cognitive load of this realization triggered a physiological response. The hands that possessed the most supreme technical control in the Northern Renaissance began to tremble during periods of acute political instability. Holbein lived in a state of permanent hyper-arousal. He was forced to constantly monitor the shifting factional alliances of the court, knowing that painting the wrong individual, or failing to paint them with sufficient flattery, could legally be construed as an act of treason. He was a man trapped in a gilded, highly perfumed slaughterhouse, armed only with a brush. By 1539, Holbein's precarious tightrope walk of survival reached its absolute breaking point. This crisis was not generated by internal court factionalism, but by a massive geopolitical shift on the European continent. Following the Henry VIII's legal break with the Roman Catholic Church and the subsequent dissolution of the English monasteries, the Kingdom of England was politically and religiously isolated. The Pope had officially excommunicated the king. For years, England had survived this isolation by exploiting the continuous warfare between the two major Catholic superpowers of Europe. The Kingdom of France, ruled by King Francis I, and the Holy Roman Empire, ruled by Emperor Charles V. However, in 1538, mediated by the Pope, Francis I and Charles V signed the Truce of Nice, followed by the Treaty of Toledo in 1539. The two superpowers suspended their hostilities and formed an alliance. The strategic implications for England were catastrophic. The treaty raised the immediate, highly probable threat of a joint amphibious Catholic invasion of the English coast, authorized by papal decree, designed to violently drag the kingdom back under the jurisdiction of Rome. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, recognized the existential threat. He required an immediate geopolitical countermeasure. England needed a military and political shield. Cromwell identified the Protestant Schmalkaldic League in Germany as the only viable ally. To cement this alliance and secure military support, Cromwell engineered a diplomatic strategy. King Henry VIII, currently a widower following the death of Jane Seymour, must marry into a prominent German Protestant ruling family. The focal point of this massive geopolitical strategy was determined to be Princess Anne of Cleves, the sister of the Duke of Cleves. The lethal parameters of this diplomatic mission were inexorably tied to the deteriorating physical and psychological state of King Henry VIII in 1539. The king was nearing 50 years old. He was entirely stripped of the athletic functionality of his youth. His physical mass had expanded exponentially. His waistline approached 54 inches. This severe morbid obesity required the installation of specialized mechanical hoists and reinforced widened doorways at Whitehall Palace, simply to move the monarch between floors. The necrotic wound on his leg, sustained in 1536, dominated his daily existence. The chronic osteomyelitis and severe venous stasis resulted in a continuous active infection. The Tudor medical staff utilized rudimentary treatments, including gold plates and the application of lanolin, but the primary protocol was the continuous agonizing lancing of the ulcer to drain the accumulated pus and blood. The olfactory reality of the rotting tissue was a permanent feature of the king's physical presence. However, as his physical body underwent this severe degradation, his psychological narcissism mutated into an extreme, impenetrable delusion. The tyrant completely dissociated from his physical reality. He remained entirely convinced that he was the most desirable, attractive, and dominant monarch in Europe. He viewed himself as the apex predator of European masculinity. Consequently, his parameters for a new wife were absolute. He demanded a flawless, pure, and flawlessly beautiful young bride to satisfy his ego. He required a woman who possessed the aesthetic perfection necessary to validate his own delusional self-image. Thomas Cromwell was fully aware of the king's shallow, absolute obsession with physical beauty. Cromwell recognized that a standard diplomatic negotiation would not secure the king's consent. The king required visual proof of the asset. Cromwell trapped Hans Holbein in a deadly diplomatic maneuver. He did not deploy Holbein simply as a court artist. He deployed him as a highly classified intelligence operative. Holbein was ordered to travel across the continent to Turin, Germany, to the court of the Duke of Cleves. His mandate was to capture the visual data of Princess Anne and transmit it back to London. Cromwell's unspoken directive: carried the weight of a legal death sentence. The painting absolutely had to be beautiful enough to convince the demanding king to sign the marriage treaty. Holbein found himself in an inescapable political vice. He was tasked with manufacturing the visual catalyst for the most critical geopolitical alliance of the decade. The survival of the English state, the survival of Thomas Cromwell, and the survival of the artist himself all hinged entirely on the precise application of pigment to a wooden panel. In the blistering summer of 1539, Hans Holbein arrived in the Duchy of Cleves. When he finally gained access to Princess Anne and observed the target, the stark physical reality hit him with the force of a physical blow. The visual data did not align with the strategic requirements of the English crown. By all objective contemporary accounts, Anne of Cleves was entirely devoid of the conventional aesthetic beauty demanded by King Henry VIII. She possessed a heavy, coarse facial structure. She had a remarkably large, prominent nasal bridge. Most critically, her dermal layer bore the deep, unmistakable pitted scarring of a severe childhood battle with the variola virus, smallpox. The hyperpigmentation and structural damage to the skin were highly visible. Furthermore, her cultural programming was entirely incompatible with the Tudor court. Raised in a strict conservative German environment, she lacked the refined graces, musical training, and capacity for flirtatious courtly banter required by Henry. She presented the clumsy, rigid physical demeanor of a sheltered provincial asset. She was heavily cloaked in thick conservative German fashion, completely obscuring her physical form. Holbein immediately calculated the lethal parameters of his situation. If he executed his humanist training and painted the ugly objective truth, the king would instantly reject the asset. The Protestant alliance would collapse. England would remain exposed to a Catholic invasion. And Thomas Cromwell, a minister who eradicated his enemies without hesitation, would undoubtedly classify Holbein's objective painting as an act of political sabotage and order his execution. Conversely, if he lied on the canvas, engineered a forgery, and the king subsequently discovered the visual deception upon her arrival, the enraged, humiliated monarch would likely have the artist flayed alive for high treason. The primal survival instinct of a deeply cynical operative seized control of the brush. Holbein chose to apply the ultimate 16th century visual filter. He lowered his sable brush to the vellum, later mounted on canvas, and systematically altered anatomical reality. He executed a calculated geometric softening of her heavy jawline, rendering it delicate and symmetrical. He significantly reduced the spatial dimensions of her nose, refining the bridge to an elegant, highly aristocratic slope. He engaged in a total eradication of the variola scarring. He painted over every single pockmark, utilizing a complex blending of lead white, vermilion, and ochre to give her skin the luminous, flawless texture of polished porcelain. Finally, he manipulated the spatial depth of the composition. He dressed her in rich, highly flattering crimson and gold embroidered garments, framing her face symmetrically. He eliminated harsh shadows, bathing the subject in a flat, ethereal light that projected an aura of mysterious, alluring majesty. Hans Holbein did not paint Anne of Cleves. He manufactured a flawless, captivating illusion out of thin air. He forged the exact visual data required to trigger the king's narcissism. He packed the highly classified deception into a wooden crate and dispatched it across the English Channel, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision with reality. The visual forgery engineered by Hans Holbein in Düren was sealed in a protective wooden crate and transported across the English Channel. In late 1539, it was delivered directly into the hands of King Henry VIII at Whitehall Palace. The immediate psychological and geopolitical reaction triggered by this specific arrangement of pigment was instantaneous and profound. When the king first viewed the portrait, his well-known vanity immediately took over. He did not see this as a simple political arrangement. Instead, he viewed the match as a clear tribute to his own power and personal appeal. The highly flattering painting of the German princess completely won his approval. Privy Council records note that the king grew remarkably eager for the upcoming marriage. Thrilled by the visual data, Henry's vanity was entirely satisfied. Operating solely on the fraudulent intelligence provided by Holbein's canvas, the king immediately issued the executive order. He commanded his ministers to finalize the diplomatic negotiations. The marriage treaty between the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Cleves was officially signed and sealed. The geopolitical shield against the Catholic powers was secured. However, the foundational premise of the treaty was a devastating lie. The English state had entered into a binding international contract based entirely on a highly manipulated, two-dimensional piece of propaganda. The stage was now mathematically set for a catastrophic collision with physical reality. In late December 1539, the physical asset Princess Anne of Cleves arrived on the English coast. She commenced her procession toward London. On January 1st, 1540, the royal entourage paused at the bishop's palace in Rochester. It was here that the visual lie manufactured on canvas violently disintegrated. King Henry VIII, unable to contain his highly stimulated anticipation, opted to deviate from the established diplomatic protocols. He orchestrated a surprise interception. The king donned a disguise, utilizing heavy cloaks to obscure his royal identity. He gathered a select group of courtiers and bypassed the official welcoming ceremonies, pushing directly into the private chambers of Princess Anne. The psychological framework of this specific maneuver reveals a deeply ingrained delusion. In the king's deteriorating narcissistic mind, he was executing a highly romantic chivalric protocol drawn from medieval Arthurian legends. The established trope of courtly love dictated that true lovers would instantaneously recognize one another through any physical disguise, bound by an invisible spiritual magnetism. Henry fully expected the beautiful German princess to pierce his disguise, fall to her knees, and declare her immediate devotion. The stark physical and cultural reality of the encounter was a humiliating, systemic failure. Anne of Cleves possessed absolutely no cultural programming regarding the English traditions of courtly love. Furthermore, the objective reality of the entity standing before her completely short-circuited the king's romantic fantasy. Anne did not see a disguised golden prince. She saw a morbidly obese, foul-smelling, disabled man in his late 40s, behaving with startling, aggressive familiarity. Startled and physically repulsed by his sudden advances, the princess reacted with visible coldness. She recoiled from his physical touch. Operating under standard conservative German protocols for interacting with aggressive strangers, she paid him zero attention, turning her back on the disguised monarchs to continue watching a bull-baiting event out the window. For King Henry VIII, the visual shock of her actual unedited appearance, the heavy jaw, the prominent nose, the vareola scarring, combined with the absolute public rejection of his romantic gesture, constituted a devastating psychological trauma. The king's fragile, heavily protected ego was completely fractured. The historical record documents the pure, visceral, unfiltered rage of the monarch. He stormed out of the chamber, his facial capillaries visibly engorged with blood, registering a deep purple hue. He retreated to a secure perimeter. In the hallway, he physically grabbed his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, by the collar of his robes. Henry roared in absolute unrestrained fury. He declared that he had been completely deceived. He stated that he felt nothing but physical revulsion for the asset. It was during this specific psychological breakdown that Henry VIII utilized the famous highly derogatory classification. He publicly compared his new bride to a Flanders mare, a heavy, clumsy utilitarian draft horse, stripping her of all aesthetic and human value. Despite the king's absolute physical revulsion, the geopolitical mechanics of the era superseded his personal desires. The diplomatic treaties had already been ratified. The political stakes of publicly insulting the German alliance by immediately returning the bride were too severe. Such an action would trigger an immediate international incident and potentially initiate the very war Cromwell was attempting to prevent. The state mandated that the marriage sequence must proceed. On January 6, 1540, the wedding was formalized. The subsequent strategic requirement was the physical consummation of the marriage. The events of the wedding night sealed the lethal fate of the Tudor court. The intense psychological revulsion toward his bride, combined with the extreme situational stress, triggered a total physiological failure in the king. A man whose cardiovascular and vascular systems were already entirely compromised by severe morbid obesity, chronic pain, and systemic disease found himself completely impotent. He was biologically incapable of achieving or maintaining an erection. The marriage was not consummated. To protect the incredibly toxic, fragile masculinity of an absolute dictator, the English state required an immediate narrative pivot. King Henry VIII held a position of absolute power, meaning he could never publicly admit to any physical limitations. The social and political climate of his reign made it impossible for him to accept fault for private marital issues. Instead of taking responsibility, the king needed to find another explanation for the situation. By the very next morning, he made sure to shift all the blame away from himself. He quickly placed the entire fault onto his new bride, who had no ability to challenge his claims. He initiated a highly coordinated, vicious whisper campaign throughout the court. He explicitly proclaimed to his royal physicians and senior ministers that the new queen's physical body was defective. He stated that her flesh was loose, that she emitted a foul odor, and that her physical attributes were so biologically repulsive, they actively stripped him of all natural virility. The tyrant's ego had sustained a critical wound. In the ruthless internal logic of the Tudor court, when the king's pride bled, actual human blood was required to cleanse the psychological trauma. As the palace descended into chaotic whispers, and the Privy Council desperately scrambled to locate the specific architect of this massive visual deception, Hans Holbein realized the sheer magnitude of his catastrophic strategic disaster. The lie he had carefully constructed in Durin had been forensically exposed. Holbein executed an immediate tactical withdrawal. He fled the corridors of Whitehall. He retreated to his private studio, locked the heavy oak doors, and established a defensive perimeter. He remained in absolute isolation. He sat in the shadows, analyzing the auditory data of the stone hallways, fully anticipating the arrival of the king's guards to shatter the door, arrest him for treasonous deception, and drag him to the execution docks. However, Holbein miscalculated the political physics of the regime. King Henry VIII required a scapegoat, but he required a target with massive political mass to effectively absorb the shockwave of his wrath. Executing a lowly foreign painter was too petty. It would not satisfy the king's deeply humiliated pride, nor would it solve the immediate diplomatic crisis. There was only one target available with sufficient structural weight. The spear of state violence bypassed the artist and pointed directly at the chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cromwell was the primary architect of the Cleves marriage. He was the operative who had forced the king's hand, pushed the Protestant alliance, and deployed Holbein to execute the visual forgery. Cromwell was now left entirely exposed. The internal factional warfare of the Tudor court immediately capitalized on this exposure. The king's psychological humiliation demanded an immediate and brutal political bloodletting. Rather than simply annulling the unconsummated marriage, Henry VIII actively weaponized his personal embarrassment, transforming his wounded pride into a calculated state purge. The royal fury required a scapegoat of massive political weight to absorb the diplomatic fallout of the Cleves disaster. He directed this lethal grievance entirely toward his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the primary architect of the Protestant alliance. By exploiting the king's volatile state, the conservative Catholic faction, led by the powerful Duke of Norfolk, seized the unprecedented opportunity to orchestrate Cromwell's abrupt downfall. They quickly poisoned the narrative, ensuring that the king's private marital disaster translated into a swift, irreversible death sentence for the most capable operative in England. On June 10, 1540, Cromwell was arrested during a meeting of the Privy Council. The Duke of Norfolk personally ripped the Order of the Garter from Cromwell's neck. Cromwell was stripped of his titles and transported directly into the damp subterranean containment cells of the Tower of London. He was denied the dignity and the legal platform of a public trial. The conservative faction utilized a bill of attainder, the exact same lethal legislative weapon Cromwell had utilized to destroy his own enemies. Parliament declared him guilty by state decree. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell, the most powerful political operative in England, was dragged out into the blinding summer sun to the execution scaffold at Tower Hill. The mechanical reality of this specific execution remains a subject of intense forensic documentation. King Henry VIII, seeking to avenge his bruised ego, deliberately denied Cromwell the standard aristocratic mercy of a swift death delivered by an experienced executioner. The state assigned the grim task to a young, grossly inexperienced apprentice. Contemporary eyewitness accounts explicitly note that this operative was heavily intoxicated at the time of the execution. The wooden block transformed into a sight of unparalleled visceral horror. The intoxicated apprentice raised the heavy iron axe, but his spatial calculation and kinetic aim were wildly inaccurate. He missed the cervical vertebrae entirely. The massive steel blade sank deep into Cromwell's right scapula, shoulder blade, shattering the bone and slicing through the trapezius muscle. High-pressure arterial blood sprayed in a wide arc across the wooden planks. The victim collapsed, writhing and groaning in excruciating, fully conscious physical agony. Panicked by the auditory screaming and the massive volume of blood, the executioner ripped the axe out of the muscle tissue. He lost all mechanical control. He began hacking wildly, blindly swinging the heavy weapon at the writhing target. The forensic data indicates it required 3 to 4 sickening, chaotic blows to complete the termination. The axe repeatedly struck the occipital bone, back of the head, completely severed the mandible, jawbone, and mangled the neck and upper thorax into an unrecognizable pulp of flesh, splintered bone, and cartilage, before the head was finally mechanically detached from the torso. The ultimate grotesque paradox of the Northern Renaissance was permanently cemented on those blood-soaked planks. The creation of a flawlessly beautiful, delicate, aesthetically perfect portrait had been paid for in the direct currency of a mutilated, destroyed human corpse. The tyrant had successfully extracted his visceral blood debt for a wounded ego. History does not function as a simple binary narrative of clear villains and passive victims. The case of Holbein's visual deception remains a subject of intense, ongoing forensic debate among art historians and political analysts. The central inquiry remains: was Hans Holbein solely responsible for the lie, acting as an active malicious deceiver? Or was he a passive pawn, trapped in Cromwell's aggressive geopolitical strategy and Henry's impossible aesthetic standards? Analysts argue that Cromwell carefully curated the operational environment in Durham. Cromwell likely controlled the lighting, the wardrobe, and the physical access to the princess, making it politically impossible for Holbein to present anything less than absolute visual perfection without risking immediate execution for insubordination. In this model, the painter was operating under extreme lethal duress. Conversely, behavioral analysts point out that Henry's explosive reaction upon meeting Anne might have been a highly exaggerated theatrical performance. It is highly probable that the king manufactured the outrage as a convenient excuse to discard a wife, the precise moment the political alliance with Germany was no longer strictly necessary, as the threat of the combined Catholic invasion had begun to wane. Furthermore, art historians suggest that by 16th century aesthetic standards, state portraiture was inherently expected to flatter the subject. Holbein simply miscalculated the king's literal biological interpretation of the image. However, the psychological truth of the event remains undeniable. Holbein, paralyzed by the constant, suffocating fear of the very state machinery that employed him, chose to prioritize his own immediate physical survival over objective truth. He deliberately generated an image that he knew was a dangerous fiction, fully aware of the highly volatile, lethal nature of the monarch he was transmitting it to. The tragedy of the Cleves portrait holds a profound, lasting structural significance that extends far beyond the Tudor era. It serves as a stark historical masterclass in the weaponization of art and media. Holbein's actions demonstrated a terrifying political reality. Within the architecture of absolute power, controlling the visual narrative is just as vital and just as deadly as controlling the military apparatus. The incident exposes the immense vulnerability of autocratic regimes to their own internal vanity. King Henry VIII possessed absolute legislative and military power, yet he was ultimately manipulated, humiliated, and driven to acts of grotesque violence by a few ounces of colored pigment spread across a piece of canvas. This forces modern audiences to fundamentally question the integrity of the historical record. If the defining images of the era, the portraits we accept as objective historical fact, were actively manufactured under the threat of execution to serve specific political agendas, a massive percentage of our visual history is simply beautifully executed state-sponsored propaganda. The documented professional history of Hans Holbein forces the observer to look past the aesthetic brilliance of Renaissance art and confront the human cost, the chronic fear, and the necessary anatomical deceptions required to produce it. Following the horrific butchery of Thomas Cromwell, Hans Holbein managed to keep his head attached to his cervical spine. The state did not execute him. The king swiftly annulled his unconsummated marriage to Anne of Cleves. The princess, demonstrating supreme survival intelligence, immediately accepted a generous financial settlement, vast estates, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister, rather than risk the executioner's block. Henry quickly moved on to execute a new, ultimately tragic marriage to the teenager Catherine Howard. Holbein was spared the axe solely because Henry VIII, despite his narcissistic rage, still possessed a lingering selfish desire to monopolize the artist's unparalleled technical capabilities. However, Holbein's career and his creative and ambitious spirit were effectively castrated. He permanently lost his exclusive favored status within the inner circle of the court. He was no longer commissioned to paint the grand, powerful royal portraits that defined the visual aesthetics of the regime. The position of primary visual architect was revoked. Instead, Holbein was marginalized. He wandered the outer edges of the Tudor court like a silent, terrified ghost. His output was drastically reduced to minor, low-level commissions for merchants and mid-ranking courtiers. He was heavily burdened by crippling, continuous paranoia and the gnawing, inescapable psychological guilt over his direct mechanical role in Cromwell's horrific demise. He had survived the political purge, but he had been neutralized as a major cultural force. In the autumn of 1543, at the age of 46, the worldly political powers that Holbein had feared so deeply finally ceased their pursuit. However, the brutal, indifferent forces of biology did not. A vicious, highly localized strain of the plague, a resurgence of the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the pathogen responsible for the Black Death, swept through the crowded, deeply unsanitary streets of London. The epidemiological reality of the Tudor capital provided the perfect environment for a catastrophic outbreak. London was a vector for rapid transmission. The city possessed zero modern sanitation infrastructure. Raw sewage flowed in open trenches. The high density of the Rattus rattus, black rat population carrying the infected Xenocilla chiopus, oriental rat flea, ensured a catastrophic mortality rate. The city rapidly transformed into a charnel house. The narrow, lightless alleys became choked with the dead. The atmospheric conditions grew thick with the smell of rotting human flesh. The physiological symptoms of the infection were rapid and terrifying. Victims experienced sudden high fevers, systemic sepsis, and the eruption of massive, blackened, gangrenous lymph nodes, buboes, in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes frequently hemorrhaged, leading to internal bleeding and death within 48 to 72 hours of exposure. King Henry VIII, maintaining his established protocol of supreme cowardice in the face of natural disease, did not remain in the capital to manage the crisis. He immediately ordered the palace doors locked. He packed his vast royal wagons and fled with his immediate court to the secure, isolated safety of the countryside. He entirely abandoned the citizens of his capital to the tolling of the death bells and the mechanics of the plague pits. Hence Holbein, lacking the vast financial resources and the aristocratic clearance required to flee the quarantine zones, remained trapped within the infected perimeter of London. In October 1543, The artist's physical defenses failed. He contracted the Yersinia pestis bacterium. He collapsed rapidly. He suffered the final agonizing stages of the disease, isolated within the very studio where he had meticulously ground the pigments that painted so many brilliant, deadly lies. The narrative culmination of Hans Holbein the Younger is defined by a brutal, unflinching asymmetry. Here was a man who had manipulated light, shadow, and chemical pigment to grant the ruthless Tudor elite a radiant, immortal life on canvas. He ensured that the faces of tyrants and their victims would be admired in pristine, climate-controlled galleries for centuries to come. Yet the architect of this visual immortality was destined to die the most wretched, anonymous death mathematically possible. His physical body, rapidly swollen, blackened, and putrefied by the plague, was unceremoniously collected by masked laborers. He was tossed from a rattling wooden dead cart. There was no state funeral. There were no royal mourners. There was no solemn procession or choral requiem. The physical flesh of one of the greatest technical masters of the Northern Renaissance was thrown directly into a massive, filthy, muddy plague pit in the heart of London. There was no headstone bearing his name. There was no marker to denote his existence. His corporeal structure dissolved into the wet, highly contaminated earth alongside thousands of impoverished, forgotten, nameless citizens. He was swallowed forever beneath the dirt, his exact location permanently erased from the geographic record. Hans Holbein the Younger embodies the ultimate, crushing tragedy of intellect and art, forced to kneel before the mechanics of absolute tyranny. He was not an inherent monster. He was not driven by sadistic malice. He was simply a frightened, cynical organism who systematically compromised his ethical and artistic soul to survive a regime built on terror, to secure another day of mortal existence in the bloodthirsty court of the Tudors. A middle-aged survivor willingly discarded objective truth. He weaponized high art, transforming the pursuit of humanism into a tool of crude, lethal deception. His masterpiece of manipulation inadvertently triggered the humiliating anatomical slaughter of a powerful statesman. This sequence of events proves a terrifying historical constant. In the shadow of delusional dictators, the most destructive weapon is not always the executioner's heavy iron blade. Sometimes the highest body count is generated by the quiet, graceful stroke of a brush that bends the truth to serve the state. The profound irony of his anonymous, decaying demise stands as a silent, inescapable testament to historical karma. The man who spent his entire adult life meticulously covering up the physical, moral, and biological rot of a tyrant, granting false immortality to a corrupt elite on canvases woven with gold, ended his days rotting in a nameless mud pit. He was discarded exactly like the daily organic refuse of the city. He was the silent witness. He was the ruthless accomplice. And in the bitter mathematical end, he was the most tragic victim of the very illusions he helped create